Welcome to the Journal of Samuel Kelly. Last time we left off with Samuel having returned to England in the Grenville. He spent some time meeting former acquaintances, some of whom he wished he hadn't seen. Ultimately, Samuel decided to leave the packet service fleet due to poor wages and his father's need for financial assistance. Convinced by several Scotchmen, Samuel enlisted in the transport service, where we find him now. I hope you enjoy this episode from the Journal of Samuel Kelly. On my arrival at Deptford, I went to the carpenter's lodgings to wait till I heard of a berth in a transport. To obtain this, my shipmates had employed one Brian, a crimp and waterman, to be on the lookout for us. Accordingly, the next day, 3 besides myself were shipped in the Jason transport, Thomas Appleby, a ship belonging to Sunderland of about 300 tons burthen and known in the north of England by the name of a bark. Other ships go there under the denomination of pinks and cats, which distinguishes their mode of construction or build of the hull. I did not altogether like the countenance of our captain, for notwithstanding he was a handsome man, there was something forbidding in his appearance, and on further acquaintance I found him to be almost everything but what he ought to be. In the evening I was called into the cabin to sign articles, where I found the captain's wife and his sister at work, ironing some washed cloths. Here I was taken to task by the female captain respecting my abilities in sea affairs, and at close of examination, she pronounced me to be no sailor because I had not served an apprenticeship in the coal trade. I was therefore put under the denomination of an ordinary seaman, and my wages fixed at 40 shillings per month, whilst my companions, many years older, were to have 60 shillings. This low wage I was not altogether sorry for, as less ability would be expected, and my disposition was inclinable to diffidence, having been in the packets almost confined to a particular kind of duty, but now I was to be traversing from masthead to masthead, and from one end of the ship to the other, there being no other man before the mast but myself and 3 old shipmates, together with master, mate, second mate, carpenter, cook, 3 young apprentices, and a little negro which our master picked up on a former voyage in Antigua. In all, our complement was 13. What a contrast was this ship's company to those that I had formerly been accustomed to in the packets, viz. 60 men, or rather more properly speaking 59, as I was told the agent at Falmouth received the pay of 1 man from each ship as a prerequisite, which reduced the complement to 59. The lumpers, who had been employed on board previous to the shipping of the crew, continued on board until the master had inspected the ship's company to answer for the complement of men required by government, and were then discharged. In a few days, having taken in all our stores, as a troop ship from the King's Yard at Deptford, we received orders to proceed to Portsmouth. Accordingly, we hauled out of the tier. When the master found it requisite to go to London on business, we therefore sheered the ship alongside a frigate in ordinary, and requested permission of the commanding officer, the cook's wife, to let us hang by the man-of-war for a tide, which was granted. This woman was the only person on board. A few hours after, her husband, the cook, returned alongside drunk, and had broken his wooden leg on shore. This man abused us much for preventing his getting on to the gangway, and threatened to turn our ship adrift as soon as he got on board. We endeavored to pacify him by civility, and assisted in getting him into the ship, where the man and his wife settled all disputes. The next day we proceeded to Blackwall, where we anchored, to return the stores our master had borrowed to pass the inspection of the transport board. The next place we visited was Gravesend. Here the crimp who had shipped us attended to receive his crimpage, and we received a month's advance. Nothing more being required here, we proceeded to the Downs and anchored opposite Deal. At this place a number of men reside, who are smugglers. Each of these has a particular signal, which being made by any vessel, the person on shore who is wanted used to spring off spirits, teas, etc., openly to supply the shipping. We embraced the first opportunity to leave this anchorage, and proceeded to Spithead, and was then ordered to anchor in Stokes Bay, the usual place of resort for unemployed transports. Here we lay for many weeks, and I used to go to Portsmouth Market in the boat once or twice a week, the master's wife, his sister, and 2 children being still on board, by which we got many a pull to Portsmouth in blowing weather to supply their cravings. Our vessel being rather light of ballast, we were employed to bring on board shingle from the beach, which we spread over the water casks stowed in the hold, making a clean and comfortable surface. The boat was hoisted up at night to prevent desertion. 2 apprentices notwithstanding found the way to get clear off. Soon afterwards we procured 2 other boys in their stead. About the 15th of December, 1782, we received orders to prepare for an expedition to Guernsey. Accordingly, the master's family took lodgings at his washerwoman's at Portsea, which was no sorrow to me. We then ran over to Cowes Road and anchored. Here we were joined by other transports for the same expedition. While laying here, I saw a poor, miserable, dirty prostitute ducked from the yardarm of one of the ships 2 or 3 times, which was an unwarrantable and unmanly action, whatever her crime might have been, as her life was much endangered by the fright. The agent for the direction, a naval lieutenant, having joined the fleet, we proceeded to Yarmouth Roads, Isle of Wight, to wait for a wind. Here we lay a week or 2. While on my night watch here, I have heard a flock of solan geese on a calm night, making a noise like a pack of hounds. At this place one of our new boys ran from the boat on shore, and I was informed that about 20 boys had deserted from this ship in a short space, by the turbulent and cruel disposition of the master. I have seen him strike one with a large iron bolt about 2 feet long. Notwithstanding the weather was now very cold, we were still kept at work on deck from daylight to sunset. After breakfast, we had an allowance of points, gaskets, etc. to make daily, though the cold benumbed our fingers that we could scarcely feel the plate in our hands. The 31st of December, 1782, we sailed for Yarmouth with the expedition. The 2nd of January, 1783, we saw the island of Guernsey. The 3rd of January, hoisted out the longboat and prepared to receive the sick and convalescent men of the 96th Regiment of Foot, and the next day completed the embarkation, having on board 190 men. Having procured an old man for a pilot, we sailed with other vessels for Jersey, it being a most formidable navigation of rocks and small islands, awful to behold. We left Guernsey the 6th, and the next day arrived at Jersey, and anchored in St. Helier's Road. On the same evening we landed the troops at St. Albans, or the Tower. On the 9th, we received on board, by our boats, 212 men of the 18th, or Royal Irish, Regiment of Foot, with their women and baggage. These men had to sleep in the same bedding used before by the sick of the former regiment. After the watch was set, one of our boys, being poorly clothed for a rainy night, crept in amongst the knapsacks, and having found a sergeant's coat, put it on. Soon after this, the sergeant, missing his baggage, came on deck with a light, and approaching the spot, the boy, fearing a discovery, slipped his lobster's shell and decamped to the other side of the boat, where he got clear without a drubbing. I think on the next night, when I had the first watch and had put out the fires on deck, I discovered a soldier raking up the scattered cinders in the hearth to kindle a small fire. I desired him to desist, on which he replied that his wife below had been just delivered of a child, and he wanted to boil something. This information I reported to our master, who permitted me to offer the soldier anything he might want for her comfort. This news he carried to the nursery, and on his return informed me that he would be obliged by receiving a little gin, probably for the good woman who attended, being the mother to one of the band. This article I delivered him, with liberty to make the fire. Every 6 soldiers, being allowed only 4 seamen's allowance of provisions while embarked, 4 inches of candle was allowed to every 6 men on board, and having occasion to go below amongst the troops soon after, I found the place completely illuminated, to the great annoyance of the poor woman, as they were also very noisy. I was told the child was to be named after the ship, Jason. This night's jollity amongst the soldiers was a great contrast to the following. During the next day we had rather rough weather, but towards evening the gale increased in strength. The wind was right in the bay, and was about 8 or 9 at night. The Fanny transport, to the windward of the fleet, broke her anchor, and fell on board the cruiser's cutter, whose anchor gave way, and both these vessels drifted down on us. To save the King's cutter from being sunk, our cable was immediately cut, and we drifted from them. When we obtained a proper distance from these vessels, our best bower anchor was dropped, and though this cable tier had been cleared before night, we could not give the vessel the cable, owing to the soldiers having spread some of their beds there unknown to us. Our vessel therefore drove into shoal water near a large reef of rocks, over which the waves were running tremendously high when our ship was brought up by the best bower. Our Guernsey pilot was in the greatest fright imaginable, so as to lose his English tongue. The army officers kept teasing our master with questions and foolish proposals during the hurricane, and he was himself in great terror, fearing that we were in shoal water while the tide was high, that at low water we should beat to pieces against the ground, and perhaps lose all our lives. The poor helpless soldiers were crawling about on their hands and knees, not being able to stand, as the vessel was tossed in a violent manner. Many of the troops placed themselves in the longboat to secure a passage on shore should the vessel go to pieces. We fired many distress guns during the first half of the night, but it was impossible to obtain any assistance. About midnight, a consultation was held when the tide was still high, what was to be done for the good of the whole, when it was determined to cut the cable and run at all adventures to gain the beach to save the lives of the people. The moon was shining bright at times through the flying clouds. 2 seamen were ordered to loose the foresail, and we got a spring on the cable to cast the ship the right way, to avoid the horrible rocks near us. The men had cast off the yardarm gaskets, and the goose wings were loose, when some man cried out a lull. This was immediately noticed and confirmed by many who concluded the gale had passed its zenith. The sail was therefore ordered to be again furled, and the wind continued to moderate till daylight. At daylight, the band assembled to play a tune on the quarterdeck, I imagine from custom or regimental orders. This aroused the fury of our master, who probably had not yet forgotten the danger of the night, and being still near the rocks, who was astonished at this inconsideration. He therefore, with the speaking trumpet in his hand, began to lay it on the heads of the musicians with great violence, which soon dispersed the harmony. Having only 2 cables, we were obliged to splice the one cut, which was performed as quickly as possible, and we sailed with the fleet for Guernsey on the 12th and arrived there the following day. On the 14th, the troops walked on shore with the poor woman that had so recently lain in of a boy. About the 17th, we had taken on board 211 men of the 83rd, or Royal Glasgow Volunteers, Regiment of Foot, and sailed with the convoy to Portsmouth. On the 23rd, 2 cutters came alongside for the troops and baggage, and conveyed them to the Pigot and Houghton East Indian men lying at the Mother Bank. As this regiment was intended for foreign service, the number of women were limited in the embarkation at Guernsey, at about 6 for each company, which caused great dissatisfaction amongst the men. One of the regiments for India lying at Portsmouth was very riotous, and compulsion was found requisite to force them afloat. On the 24th, we moored our ship at Gosport, and the master's family returned on board. We now got an addition of another female, by exchanging our mate for another, the new one bringing his wife with him. Our old mate was rather too easy with the men, and was as happy as a prince when he had some beer to drink and a good stock of tobacco. He had 2 papers of £1 each of shag lying about in his cabin. His quid was about the size of a pigeon's egg, which on going to rest he stuck up in the crevices of his bed-place, but was not sufficiently prudent to resume it in the morning, and as those monstrosities increased in number from time to time, they were left behind him as a decorating legacy in the cabin of his successor. Our new mate was a Scotchman and a politician, by making a fair show where it was likely the master would cast an eye, but was short of that sincerity which was observable in his predecessor. He often amused himself on the violin. I was now placed completely under petticoat government. My female captain, on her return to the ship, informed me that I was to content myself with ½ pound of brower sugar per week, with the benefit of the tea leaves when well drawn. I was now made her complete drudge, and had to fetch milk, beer, barm, etc. from Gosport, and carry the bread to and from the bakehouse, clothes to and from washing beyond Portsmouth, and many other domestic affairs. Somewhere about this period, I received the intelligence of the death of my father, who had been to me a kind and affectionate parent, though very reserved in communicating anything relative of his past life to his children. There was much of the gentleman to be discovered in his address and conversation, walked very upright from his having been in the army in his youth, and I believe him to have been an upright, honest man, though he did not profess to be a serious Christian. He had just sufficient money left to pay the expenses of his funeral and was, I hope, taken away in mercy before he was reduced to want. A general peace having taken place, we were now ordered to prepare for receiving discharged men from the Navy and to convey them to their native places before they had squandered away their money. Accordingly, a vane was fixed to the masthead to signify that our ship was to take men to Leith, in Scotland. As the seamen were paid off, they resorted to the transports destined for different ports in Ireland, Scotland, and Britain. Having received 127 men, chiefly from the Edgar and Elizabeth line of battleships, we sailed on the 1st of April, 1783, for Leith. Those men, being now free from restraint, took the management of our ship in a great measure on themselves, that is, in taking in and making sail at their pleasure. And on our anchoring in the Downs, they purchased a quantity of spirits, with which they made very free, and this increased wantonness and disorder, and as they have a great antipathy to pursuers and stewards, I came in for a share of their malignity, and had the cheese that I had issued thrown back at my head, merely for its having suffered a little from decay, and it was not safe at all times for me to appear on deck, and I was afterwards informed by the steward of the Fanny transport that they had or were intending to reeve a rope to hang him at the yardarm. The Navy officers we had on board thought it prudent to join the men in their dances and merriment, for fear of what might otherwise happen. They purchased a large red broad pendant of our master, on which they affixed the word Edgar, and hoisted it at the main top-gallant masthead. About this time, several of the men being drunk, one of their party was killed by stifling him whilst in bed, by heaping other beds upon him in their mirth, and on the evening of the next day he was thrown overboard. This sad catastrophe threw some damp on their gaiety. In the course of a week from our sailing, we drew near the Firth of Forth, and having discovered the light on the Isle of May in the evening, we plied off and on till daylight, when we ran up the Firth. As the weather was fine, several boats came alongside, which were immediately hired to land the men according to their wishes in different parts of the Forth. Therefore, before we gained our anchorage, most of our cargo had been delivered. This being beef and pudding day, many a pudding, boiling in the coppers, was abandoned by its owners, and which fell into the share of our crew, who were allowed no flour, and our daily food from month to month was only beef and peas pudding for dinner and supper. We dropped our anchor about noon above New Haven in Leith Roads, and rigged our skiff with 2 spreet sails to go on shore at Leith. The next morning the master and 2 of us left the ship, the wind blowing very fresh down the Forth, which speedily landed us in the harbor, when I was dispatched to market, and on inquiring for greens, a garden woman, to induce me to buy spinach which she had on sale, told me that 1 pennyworth of spinach was better than 2 pennyworth of green kale. We here visited a public house known by the name of Locky Curry's, where we obtained an excellent bottle of London porter for 4 pence, with bread and cheese in the bargain, it being customary in this country to the public houses to give something to eat for nothing to those who pay for the drink. I found it so in many places, both sides of the Forth. Having obtained our requisites here, we prepared for our return by reefing the sails, etc., our ship lying some miles off directly to windward. Having made sail, we found it very difficult to work out of the harbor, being very narrow, and had nearly swamped the boat in the attempt. But providentially we weathered the rocks, and in less than 2 hours got alongside our vessel. I had always a dislike to open sailing boats, especially if they were ballasted with ponderous materials such as iron pigs or stones. But generally this ship's boats were ballasted with gang casks filled with water and lashed to the benches or thwarts, so that if the boat should fill with water, she could not sink, and would float the crew as long as they could hold on. Our master's wife having an inclination to see the city of Edinburgh, we took her on shore, and from Leith she and her husband took coach for the metropolis of North Britain. As soon as they departed, I set off on foot for the same place, intending just to peep into the city and return to the boat immediately. On my way, I entered into conversation with a wayfaring man respecting the place, who behaved very civil in describing the country, and even stepped out of his course to show me what is called the New Town. When having seen the register office, a grand advocate's house, and a square, I hastened back to Leith, where I arrived long before our gentry. The houses on what is called Bunker's Hill were 8 or 10 stories high, near Edinburgh Bridge, and the servant woman at Leith neither wore shoes nor stockings, which had a mean appearance. One evening our crew assembled with 2 of their wives at the public house kept by Lockie Curries, who had 2 daughters, and being at that time in my natural state and an enemy to God, I saw no harm in being one of the party at a dance. I had been under the tuition of a French master at Helston, and was fond of this vanity. We drank whiskey punch during the evening and had supper gratis. I observed the people of this place were fond of snuff. This article was kept in a cow's horn, to which was sometimes chained a brass spoon, full of little holes, and a hare's foot. The former was called a pen, in which the tobacco was lifted to their nose. The holes emitted air to assist the drawing of it into the head, and what remained on their upper lip and face was brushed off with the other instrument. About the latter end of April we sailed with a fair wind, and reaching Tynemouth Bar, we ran in and moored ship off South Shields. This place was so very full of smoke that it turned our bright, newly painted deck and sides almost black. On the back of the town, I was amazed to see the hills of ballast carted from the colliers on their return from London and other places, and which perhaps had been accumulating for several centuries. I was also much pleased in viewing the expertness of the pilots here in managing and dropping up on the tide, not single ships only, but large tiers of vessels fast to each other, controlled by the sails of 1 or 2 of the number. There are on this river a vast number of keels or barges employed in bringing coals from the pits of the vessels, loading at North and South Shields, which makes the scene very lively. Having now taken in our coals, we sailed for Portsmouth, and arrived safe at Spithead about the 3rd week in May. Our ship was much haunted with rats. We therefore employed a rat catcher from Portsmouth, who laid oatmeal balls containing poison in different parts of the vessel, and on my going down in the afterhold, 2 or 3 hours after it had been deposited, I heard a most pitiful outcry from a number of these animals, and killed 1 or 2 that were unable to escape from me. The stink from the dead in a little while was very disagreeable, and I think we found some buckets full of rats amongst the casks which we threw overboard. I hope you enjoyed this episode from the Journal of Samuel Kelly. Please like, subscribe, and follow on whatever platform you're listening. Be sure to check out other ways you can support this project and others in the description. And tune in next time for more from the Journal of Samuel Kelly.